Hi, my name is Chad Hammer. I'm the invasive plant biologist with the Maine Natural Areas Program with the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. My background is primarily in forestry and forest ecology and invasive plant biology and management. I also have a master herbicide applicator license. In this presentation, I will discuss things to consider when planning, prioritizing, and setting goals for invasive plant management. I broke this presentation up into two different categories. The first one is ways to prioritize. And then the second is things to consider when conducting invasive plant management. These together can be very important when setting goals and planning management techniques and strategies. The first component is ways to prioritize. And I've broken this down into two main principles. The first one is a plant species basis, and the second one is a site basis. And these are not mutually exclusive. They're often both operating at the same time and considered equally and together in your management plans. And for plant species basis, you're really considering the plant species, maybe the plant phenology, its dispersal, and its impacts on the landscape. So maybe you might want to prioritize plant species that are new to a certain property or new to your area. We'll talk a bit about that later, but that's really thinking about early detection, rapid response in a certain area or property, or also if these species are localized versus widespread. A certain plant species might have very high measurable, unacceptable impacts to the property or to the landscape that might not be acceptable to you versus a species that has a lower impact, which wouldn't be as high of a priority. Maybe a plant species has very high dispersal rates, so maybe it produces has a very high fecundity and produces thousands, if not millions, of seeds in this population versus a species that reproduces a lot less quickly. And for site basis, you might want to consider managing outlier populations first. And again, we'll talk more about that in greater detail in a minute. But really prioritizing small populations on the fringe or on the outskirts of more core, larger infestations. You might want to prioritize special habitats. You might want to prioritize populations upstream, as they'll constantly be dispersing propagules downstream. And also areas soon to be harvested would be a priority, or any area where there will be a disturbance taking place, as these smaller infestations can get large really quickly and get really out of hand after any type of disturbance or opening up that canopy, allowing for more resources for the invasive plants. So that would be a high priority. And maybe even high dispersal areas would be a priority. So any area that these plants are growing where there's a great risk for them dispersing on the landscape. So that might be a stream or a river, maybe trails. So for recreational or hiking trails, a lot of times seeds or even wet mud will stick to boots and seeds will move that way. So it's good to consider recreation, ATVs, even horse trails, and even game trails where wildlife are heavily using these areas. A lot of these seeds can also stick to their hooves, or they're even feeding on them, and then pooping them out down the trail. And this is just another way to think about it. That's a little redundant, but sometimes that's a good thing. So some of our major priorities could be special habitats, and again, areas for at risk of dispersal, maybe valuable timber stands or heavy recreational areas. And again, these areas are just, there's a high risk of dispersal. And also there's monetary value attached to our healthy ecosystems in areas like this. We may want to prioritize eradication of new species and eradication of isolated populations. And maybe our next priorities, or not so high priorities, would be suppressing bad infestations and containing larger patches. So an example of this could maybe be even cutting off seed heads are trying to knock back our large populations a little bit. And I think this diagram here really sums up nicely the idea of prioritizing isolated populations first and then attacking the core areas last. Let me try this laser pointer here. So what we have here is a large infestation, and over time we have more scattered, isolated populations showing up a little bit of distance away from that core infestation. And that's really where our control work should begin, is these small, isolated populations, and then over time working towards our core area, which is our lower priority. So this is a way to prioritize control efforts based on the size and intensity of the infestation, managing our smaller infestations first. And what this really does is prevent smaller infestations from becoming unmanageable and working towards that core infestation. And I see it time and time again where folks will jump right in and attack these large populations, the core area. In the meantime, all these small populations are also getting out of hand and unmanageable as well. So it's good to nip those in the bud and eliminate them and then work on that core area after that. This is another great image to think about prioritization and more of that early detection, rapid response, or thinking about if a species is more early detection, rapid response category or a localized category versus a widespread category. You can think about this on any scale, really, whether that's a given property or a town or a region or even a whole state. So when we look at this, what we see time on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we see area infested, and then control costs. And as you would guess, as area infested goes up, well, as time goes on, area infested goes up, and control costs also goes up as well. And where we really want to catch this is when time almost at time zero, that's when we're working more on prevention, so try to prevent a species or invasive species from showing up. A good way to prevent an infestation would be monitoring, and then maybe hand pulling right away or managing that right away. But here we see where time is still pretty low, we see an introduction occurring, and that's where eradication is still possible. And that's really where we want to be catching these infestations. And again, monitoring is a huge part of that. But then as time goes on, eradication may not be possible anymore. We kind of have to move into containment. That's when the area infested goes up. And if we are working on containment, it's more of a very long-term thing, and you can then expect the control cost would go up as well. And if time keeps on going on and we still don't have it under control, we have to really move into more asset-based protection. So protecting our infrastructure, protecting power lines, things like that. And success is very hard at that point, and control costs are really through the roof. So again, it's good to catch it early. And this is just an example of that. This is an early detection rapid response efforts a few years ago, where there was some giant knotweed, which is pretty uncommon in the state. We do have a few isolated populations of giant knotweed. Now, Japanese knotweed is very common, but there is a giant knotweed, which is a different species, and it's much larger, functionally very similar, but it just gets much larger and much larger leaves and stems. It gets about twice as tall. So this was on some BPL land in Aroostook County, where we had found a few stems of giant knotweed. We pulled it right away and monitor it, and it hasn't come back. And on the left here, we see this was after Hurricane Irene, which was responsible for spreading a lot of this Japanese knotweed after high flow events and hurricanes and flooding. You can really just see giant Japanese knotweed propagules just floating down the streams and rivers. And what happens is they land on a shore of a bank of a river, And as you can see on the top center image there, there's just one sprout. So these plants can have roots and shoots that they can shoot out from their nodes and root when they come in contact with soil or water. That's what happened here. And you really want to catch that early, because what can happen if you don't catch it, it can really turn into just taking over the whole bank. I'm sure we've all have seen it, where there's just acres and acres of Japanese knotweed. So the goal is to eradicate it early and nip it in the bud. This is the list of one of our invasive plant manuals. It just really goes over the concept of localized versus widespread. As we can see here, these species are all localized or early detection rapid response species. And to be considered localized, a species has to be present in fewer than 8 counties in the state. So these might be a higher priority than something that's widespread or that we might see in all of the counties of the state. And then even more of a priority, we'll see this early detection rapid response, and that is where we only have a handful of isolated populations in 1 or 2 counties, and we really want to eliminate this species from our state. So a good way to find out if the plant that you're dealing with is widespread versus localized would be first to properly identify it. And then you can either look in the main invasive plant field guide, or you can also use IMAP invasives, which we'll talk a little bit about that later in another video, where you can really filter on a given species and see its distribution for the whole state. So not only do we consider early detection rapid response or localized species, but you may want to prioritize newly colonized sites. So you may have a widespread species like maybe honeysuckle, but you only have 1 or 2 on a given site. So that would be a high priority as well, to really eliminate that species, that infestation, before it really builds up its seed bed in the soil. And then it could really explode if it's there for multiple years. So again, this is just considering an isolated or low abundance on any given site would be a high priority. And this is beginning with Habitat, which is within Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. So this is their website. And they do have some great interactive maps. So they have a map viewer, and you can print these maps. And you can really look at these maps through different lenses on different habitat types. So here we see riparian habitats. We see special plant and animal habitats. We see all of our conserved lands and undeveloped habitats. So this is a great way to look at our high quality habitats and a good way to prioritize these special habitats. Okay, let's take a short break, and when we return, we'll cover some things to consider when planning for invasive plant management. All right, so now we're going to move on to things to consider when planning invasive plant management. All right, so our plant management often depends on plant phenology, population size, location or the site, and timing and seasonality. And some of these are pretty connected. You know, for example, plant phenology and seasonality are pretty connected, but they're also different. So we'll go through some of these. So for plant phenology, it's important to consider timing of the plant's life cycle events, such as when they're leafing out, you know, maybe when they're leafing out, and like we talked about, maybe our natives are still asleep, so that would be dormant. So that would be a good time to potentially manage or survey. When these plants are flowering, so that's important for management, so we don't want to disrupt our pollinators. When they're producing fruit or seeds, is managing well there's seeds or fruits on these plants can actually spread them and spread these seeds a lot further than they normally would. So for population size, you'd want to consider, which we talk quite a bit about, is it an isolated infestation or more of a core infestation? And those would be managed differently. and the priority would be different as well. You'd want to consider the location or the site. So we talked a bit about that as well. So thinking about our special habitats that you'd want to protect, or our dispersal site. So again, next to water, or thinking about wildlife. So what wildlife are utilizing these plants? Are wildlife spreading these plants? Things like that. And then timing or seasonality. So spring versus fall, your management might be different. And you also have to think about when the plant is translocating or moving resources from its roots to its above ground biomass. And then conversely, when it's taken resources from its above ground shoots and leaves and moving resources back down to its root system. So management would definitely be a lot different on spring versus fall, and also in the middle of summer. Again, for timing and seasonality, you'd want to think about our pollinators. You don't want to do anything that would disrupt them. You'd also want to think about rain events. So if we're using herbicides, you would definitely want to avoid rain, as that can dilute the herbicide, and also move our herbicides into our water column and aquifers more readily if there is a rain event. You also want to consider drought. So during drought, a lot of these plants are starting to shut down, and maybe they're not translocating as much as they would be if they were happily growing. So that would be important to consider as well. All right, and this is just some options to consider when we're managing invasive plants. You may want to consider physical removal, so hand pulling, cutting, things like that. But this may cause significant soil disturbance. So you also really want to think about soil disturbance. Soil disturbance can be bad because that it may promote regeneration of the seed bed when you have bare exposed soil, more resources hitting those seeds, versus if they're maybe buried in a litter and duff. Some of them will have decay and rot from pathogens. So you may not want to think about soil disturbance, and soil disturbance would also be bad for a lot of our native plants, and also erosion. Another option might be covering with mulch or tarps. And again, this could be efficient as well, effective, but this also takes many years to work and can cause significant loss to soil life, and also loss to native plants as well. So if revegetating is a priority, you may have to leave this covered for 5 to 7 years, sometimes even 10. And then you'd have to think about revegetating after that. So it's really, you may not have native plants reoccupying a site like this for 5 to 10 years. Solarization can be effective, but unfortunately, in a lot of our northern climates, it's less effective, as we have a very short window of opportunity to have the solarization be effective. We can consider cutting or mowing. This could be very effective on some plants, but it's not very effective on established perennial plants. Often cutting or mowing may take 5 to 8 times per year for 5 years. So it's very labor intensive. But something like some type of grass, then maybe that would be very effective. And also herbicides. So this can be very effective, and oftentimes it's the least disruptive for our soil. We can also establish our native plants very shortly after we use herbicides as well. Okay, and here we have some things to consider when we're recommending or using herbicide treatments. And I do want to say too, we should always really be, I highly recommend consulting or using a licensed applicator for herbicide treatments. There's a lot of things we really need to consider when using herbicides, and it's definitely recommended to consult or hire a licensed applicator. But some things we need to consider: our herbicide choice and timing are different for each individual species. So really thinking about that plant phenology. And also, so when are these plants producing seeds? When are they moving resources from when are they translocating and taking things down to their roots, and also when do they flower and when are our pollinators active? So things like that. We also really have to consider water. So variance is often needed to do any application, broadcast application within 25 feet of a high water mark. We can do some treatments within that 25 feet if it's very targeted, maybe cut stump treatments, small amounts of non-powered broadcast spraying. But again, consult with a licensed applicator. And there's a couple different methods you can use. Herbicides are very effective as foliar applications. With invasive plant management, we often use triclopyr or glyphosate. Now, these are systemic herbicides where the plant takes it from its surface, whether it's its leaf surface or our bark surface, and really moves it into the plant systemically and translocates those chemicals down to its roots, which is very effective for killing a lot of our perennial plants that we want to be killed. Also, cut stump applications are really useful as well. And that's where we're using these glyphosates or triclopyr solutions applied immediately after cutting that stump and just really targeting that cut surface and just putting a little bit of herbicide along that cambium layer, that inner bark layer of that cut stump. So another thing we want to consider, always using herbicides, is the risk of drift. So foliar applications do have a higher risk of drift. So you really want to always consider wind speed. So and also you always want to be spraying more towards the ground. You would not want to be, you want to avoid spraying over your head. And you also want to avoid using herbicides um, when our wind speeds are higher than 10 miles per hour. You really want to try to find that sweet spot of 2 to 10 miles per hour. And we're also often with invasive plant management, whether if we are using mechanical treatments or herbicide treatments, a lot of our management is cutting the above ground biomass, waiting for that plant to resprout, and then treating those sprouts. And treating those sprouts might be, again, you might just cut those sprouts, or you might cut them and use the cut stump treatment, or you might do a foliar application of those cut sprouts. And that really does two things where exhausting a lot of the energy reserves of that plant because it takes energy to resprout and put all of that energy into that new above ground biomass. So we're really treating that plant when it's at a weakened state. It also makes herbicide treatments more manageable. So again, we don't have to necessarily spray a 10-foot tall shrub. We can cut it, let it resprout, and then treat those shorter, lower to the ground sprouts. Okay, another treatment strategy is a cut stump treatment or a basal bark treatment. These are extremely low risk for people in the environment and also very almost no potential for any type of drift or overspray. So this is a very targeted application. There's a very low amount of high concentrated herbicide which is used along that cambium layer of that cut stump. All right, and this is just we have some definitions here and things to think about when we are setting specific goals. So I'll just go over some of these definitions. So we have eradication, which is getting rid of for good with low chance of reinfestation. And like I have there, eradication is not the only ideal goal. Containment, keep an existing footprint. Do not allow that population to expand. Exclude. So we may exclude something or keep it out of an uninfested area. And also suppress, so restrict its ability to grow and produce seed. So just a couple notes on this. It might not be sufficient or even realistic to say that our goal is to get rid of all the invasives or to eradicate them. Getting rid of it is not realistic unless it's a very small infestation in the landscape and it's not widely invaded with that certain species. Oftentimes, eradication is only realistic if the landscape context is good and the dispersal rate of that plant is low. And if we can't eradicate, containment might be useful for species which spread mostly vegetatively, or maybe you can't use herbicides. And sometimes we'll use suppression. So that's an example of this would be cutting large shrubs back, but not necessarily digging them up if you're looking to just suppress or not using an herbicide. So you may want to suppress it. You want to cut them back. Maybe you want to reduce their ability to reproduce. So again, you're cutting all that large biomass. So just some examples of these are, so reducing their extent, decreasing their density, preventing seed production, keeping vines from killing trees, or maybe just maintaining access to infrastructure, keep knocking these plants back and keeping them off power lines, telephone poles, and buildings and things like that. There are other options than eradication when eradication is not possible. And these goals change over time, so it's called adaptive management. All right, and these are some really good ways to think about how we would prioritize our management. Maybe been thinking about eradication versus containment and suppression, and just thinking about what you would do in this scenario. So here is these are courtesy of New Hampshire Fish and Game Department in a publication called Picking Our Battles. So for example, they have your strategy. Start with small populations or deal with spot fires or outliers first. So really, when you're thinking about what you would do here, you'd want to target A first. So again, those spot fires, those outliers or isolated populations. So I would target A, try to eliminate that, and then suppress B. So you can, if you don't have the resources to try to eradicate B, you may just want to cut that above ground biomass. And once you eradicate A, maybe suppress or reduce the ability for B to produce seed and expand any further. And then you may want to deal with that at a later time. So again, eradicate A and maybe suppress or contain B until you can work on more of an eradication over time. But what would also be important is monitoring. So after you eradicate A and are working on B, you would also want to continuously monitor in these forested settings to make sure that B isn't spreading. And again, that could be some distance away. Birds are often responsible for spreading these, wildlife, and you don't really know where they're going to pop up. So always monitoring your high priority areas, your trails, your forest edges, but then doing a couple passes through our core forests as well, interior forests, to make sure there's no surprises. And this is just another example. So kind of what would you do situation. So looking at the image on the right here, first I would again eradicate A. So that's more of an upstream population that can disperse downstream or constantly be moving propagules downstream or producing seed and then being dispersed through water. So conversely, if you were to target B and deal with B first, you would always still have A upstream spreading its propagules downstream from that water. So a lot of times it's important to prioritize your upstream populations first. So kind of same scenario as the last one. I would eradicate A first and then eradicate B second, and then always surveying downstream. So again, we have a seed bed where these plants, after they're growing for many years, you can have thousands of these seeds in the soil, and especially along streams and rivers, as you have erosion and bank collapse. We have a lot of our soil and our topsoil entering our water. So even after that plant is gone, let's just say you cut them, they're gone, you can still have some propagule pressure coming from that seed bank. So just making a point that, again, monitoring is always very important. And while we're on the topic of monitoring, on the left here, we also see some knotweed tarping. So this is some solarization, some tarping of some Japanese knotweed. So using some black geotextile or a plastic film, at least 7 mil thick, and leaving that covered for multiple years But what you really want to do is monitor these edges, because what will happen with some of these rhizomatous plants is when they're suppressed like that, they know they're in trouble, and they'll actually expand their range. So we will see some sprouting, and it's expanding its footprint on the outskirts of that tarp. So it's really important, again, to monitor these sites and then just basically cut those above ground shoots as soon as you see them. This is just going back to herbicides a little bit. Just if you are applying herbicides on or near water or in different states or municipalities, just some things to think about. You may need a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers or the EPA for waste discharges for using herbicides near water. You may need a permit from Maine DEP and a variance from the Board of Pesticide Control. If you're in Portland or some municipalities, you will need a permit from the city or town. And again, just recommending that herbicide application should be done by a licensed commercial pesticide applicator. Here we have some resources who can do any control work that you might need. So on the bottom left there, we have, this is on the Maine Natural Areas page website, non-herbicide and herbicide invasive plant control businesses. And we also have a list of licensed companies offering services to control invasive plants on the Maine DACF Got Pests website. And here we have some things to consider when the work is done. So invasive plant, I can't say the work is done because that's deceiving. Maybe you treated these populations for the first year, and maybe you cut them or you applied herbicides. So then what? What's next? This takes many years of repeating management and monitoring and being very persistent. Just some things to consider. We talked a little bit about it, but seed banks can last for many years in that soil. So you can have germination years after those parent individuals are gone. You might have resprouting. So a lot of these plants have very strong root and rhizome systems. So even after you remove the plant, if you have roots breaking off into the soil, you can have resprouting. Or again, if you're smothering something, you may have resprouting along the edges. You really need to pull those resprouts or mow them quickly to avoid any photosynthesis and those plants storing newly acquired energy. Again, thinking about our birds and our wildlife that can continue to spread these seeds and these propagules into new areas. So even after you remove these parent individuals, you may still constantly receive invasive plant propagule pressure. So once again, monitoring is very important. And then we have to think about sometimes in some sites revegetation plans. So that could be very important to restore ecosystem services back on the landscape and also add some bioresistance to invasive plants in the future. And this is a slide just showing a couple things to consider when we're thinking about revegetation plants. You want to think about your soil conditions, your soil texture, your water availability for these plants in the soil, sunlight, your existing vegetation, water movement, so rooting depths, things like that, what type of habitats you're in. These are just some examples of some desirable native species that you might want to plant. And when you think about what types of native plants to plant to compete and to replant in these newly available open areas where our invasives were, you really want to plant something native, fast growing, or something that spreads quickly after it's established. Make sure you match the current conditions and habitat. And ultimately, you also want to make sure that the plant is filling that same niche space or occupying that same space that the invasive plant that's at risk of coming back would also occupy. So a lot of these plants really need to find an open niche space. So if you can fill that niche space with something else, that space will not be available for something coming in or a new invader. Just some examples here are this is more for full sun, kind of moderate soil moisture. We have serviceberry, bearberry, chokeberry, choke cherry, sweet fern, bayberry, and beach plum could be some good examples. And here is some more examples for more of a wetter site. We have some rose species, some similar, some crossover from the other list there, like chokeberry, chokecherry, but also some rose species. Willows do great, and dogwoods do great in more soil moist conditions. And here are some great resources to find some of these plants. We have Native Plant Trust. This is a great resource to find native plants that might fill the niche and the conditions that you're looking for. You can kind of search a wide range of species and also put in different variables or characteristics that you're looking for, and it'll spit you out a list of species that could do the job. And on the right here, we have New England wetland plants. So they sell plants, they sell seed mixes. And this example I put here is just a great example of a seed mix that has grasses, grasses are highly competitive. Also has wildflowers, which are great for pollinators and wildlife. And also has shrubs in there as well. So that's a great seed mix there. And planting, if the resources do not allow for planting individual saplings and plants and trees, then you may have to resort to using more of a seed mix if you have a larger area. What could also be a great option is doing both. So if you have some open area and some bare soil, you can maybe plant trees and shrubs, and also seed grasses. And this would be a great mix to use, where it has grasses, flowers, and shrubs. So again, kind of doing both seeds and replanting. It's all about increasing that bioresistance. And something else you could do is report it. So IMAP Invasive is a great resource to report invasions and also look at invasions in your area. And that's going to do it for this presentation. I hope you learned something, and thanks for joining me. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me at chad.hammer@maine.gov. Thank you.